Okay, well, thank you and welcome back. So we're going to take up our continued discussion of the transition to GRI standards. We'll still in item 4, and in this case, we're going to ask Laura to take us through SRS 402, market presence. So, Laura?
Thank you. And this is another standard for which we have received comments from the GSSB on the employee worker changes. And we have received those comments for disclosure 402.1, and that is starting in line 130. So I repeat again, line 130. So disclosure 402.1 was a G4 indicator looking at the ratio of the entry-level wage by gender compared to the minimum wage by significant locations of operation. And this indicator was to be reported only when a significant proportion of the workforce was compensated based on wages subject to minimum wage rules. Following the overarching recommendation of the ad hoc technical committee to stop using the term workforce, on the 2nd of May paper, you see the alternative wording that the technical committee has suggested, and that reads as follows. So the ratio would be reported when a significant proportion of the compensation is based on wages subject to minimum wage rules. We have received substantive comments from GSSB members ahead of the meeting. There were two key issues raised by the GSSB. One is that it is unclear how a significant proportion of the compensation is to be determined. There's currently no guidance on how to assess that. And the other issue raised is that the basis for reporting on this disclosure has shifted from the number of people affected by wages subject to minimum wage rules to the fraction of the compensation that is related to minimum wage, which could actually include very few highly paid individuals that could distort the assessment for this disclosure. So we have drafted a couple of options to kickstart the discussion by the GSSB now. One option would be, if I can go ahead, one option would be using the terminology workers performing the organization's activities. We have put together some pros and cons for the two options that we have drafted. With this option in front of you, one of the benefits that we see is that by covering not just employees, but also workers who perform the organization's activities, we would be potentially covering those workers that are particularly at risk of being paid less than a minimum wage, for example, workers in the supply chain. On the other hand, with this change, we would be potentially increasing the scope of the disclosure compared to G4, and it might be challenging to obtain the data. The other option we wanted to suggest for discussion would be something similar to what we have decided this morning for one of the occupational health and safety disclosures. So option 2 would be requiring the ratio for employees only, and to then recommend the ratio for other workers performing organizations' activities besides employees. Again, some of the pros and cons with option 2. It should be more feasible for organizations to collect the data since it is only requested for employees, and data should be readily available. On the other hand, we are reducing the scope of the disclosure compared to G4, since in G4 we were covering employees and supervised workers with the ratio. But what we have seen in checking a few reports ahead of the meeting is that organizations tend to report the ratio for employees only anyway, so we might be actually adjusting to the reporting reality. So just to sum up, There's two options to start a discussion. One would be using workers performing the organization's activities. The second option would be requiring the ratio for employees only and recommending this information for other workers performing organization's activities. And just a note that with the second option, we would be narrowing down the scope of the disclosure compared to G4.
Okay, thank you. So, comments from the board? Dwight?
Well, I think what the change proposed by the technical committee that I was on was to get rid of the word workforce. And that wasn't related to this disclosure. It was related to the need for consistency throughout all of the standards we do. And the general idea was embodied in the concept of work performed, the activities of the organization, which I want to recall we discussed at the last meeting, and that was more or less the language that people compromised on. Now, as was correctly said, the intent of G4 was far broader than employees. And the reason for that is this particular standard is concerning the economic impact of the organization in the broader community. And so therefore, and what it's looking at is the relationship of money given to people as a result of the organization's activities that is above the minimum wage. Now, I don't think that there actually is any problem in defining how this works, because the minimum wage sets an hourly rate usually, and so therefore you're talking about workers who are paid on an hourly basis and not on a salary basis or something else. And so I think it's pretty easy to actually calculate that. It's not that difficult. But of the two options, essentially, I think it would have to be the first option, because the elimination of the word workforce as the technical committee proposed it did not substitute a word exactly. And if there's a need to add clarity, then you need to add the broader word, which is done in option one.
Okay, thank you. Stian and then Kristen.
Eric, my take is option 2, and what typically happens for your employees, you will have a value. For the rest of the workforce, including contractor service providers, how I will cover that in a report is in a narrative, because part of your supplier agreements, assessments, they need to confirm that they pay minimum wages, but I won't have sight of those, the fee that they pay the workers, yet they have confirmed that they will pay at least minimum wages. So I will go for option 2.
Thank you. Kristen?
I agree with Stian, and even though it can be claimed that going for option 2 is significantly narrowing the scope, in reality I don't believe it will, because I do believe, as Laura has confirmed, very few organizations have understood it like anything else than their own employees, which is to a certain extent possible to do. And please be aware that even collecting all this information for own employees is a challenging task, because there are different wage systems in different countries, even in different legal entities within a company there can be. So it isn't just to push the button, as some tend to believe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. David?
Yeah, I can see that option 1 is very difficult and challenging to collect, but it's the whole point of this particular disclosure, and if we narrow it down just to employees, yes, it's easier to report, but it misses the point of this disclosure. So I'm not sure that that has any value.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
I do not agree that we will miss the point of the indicator to only include employees. It would certainly have a value in its own to be sure that the company's own employees have proper salary conditions. If the own employees don't have it, then we cannot regard that or expect the company to or reporting organization to be occupied about its contractor employees and other suppliers.
Okay, thank you. Dwight? And then,
Well, I agree with David, and I think the problem is this in the real world, that the trend has been for companies to spin off certain kinds of activities to other organizations. And often is the case that these activities, once spun off, receive lower wages. And often they might involve, for instance, a single group of workers, for instance, women or something like this. And so the kind of impact the organization is making economically by spinning this work off means that the organization's impact might not be as great as this indicator is trying to measure. And so I do think it defeats the purpose. And the problem, of course, and it gets back to what I said before our break, is that the problem is, as organizations try to remove themselves from responsibility for the people who perform their work, you're going to have more difficulty in getting this kind of reporting, and that's the situation here. And, I'm reminded of the lawyer's joke. The man who was charged with murder and convicted threw himself on the mercy of the court because he was an orphan. And when he murdered his parents. And I spoiled that joke. But anyway, and I spoiled the joke in this public meeting, and that's awful. That's twice as bad. But at least I caught it a little bit. But anyway, the point of the matter is that I don't see how you can have the purpose of this measurement if you don't go to this notion of people performing the workers' activities and it being beyond the employment relationship. To go to the easier thing is also to cancel the measurement.
okay, thank you. Nukama?
With the growing outsourcing happening across the world, it will be difficult to report the option one, but the option one is where the real challenge is. That is where the minimum wages are not paid. That is where the real issue is. Whereas normally, if you look at the employees, the minimum wages are normally covered. So the challenge is not in reporting the option two, but we need to, the companies needs to report the option one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
If we should go for option one, I would recommend that we do as we did with 603, split it, so that you report, the requirement is to report for the employees and then for for other workers. Because for employees, it's possible to get information that is quantitative and or it might be possible to get quantitative information that is quite reliable, while for other workers could be more appropriate to do it as some sort of a narrative or management approach, saying how this is being handled in the relationship with contractors and other suppliers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, I was going to vote for option one for the same reasons that have been suggested, but I like Kirsten's second option, which would be to include both separated. I think that might work well.
Okay. Other comments? Michael?
Actually, you might have covered this and I missed it, and I apologise if so. But why are we using words workers performing the organisation's activities rather than the words we used last time about work controlled by? What's the difference in intent?
Dwight?
Well, in the case of health and safety, it's the control element that is the important element, because it goes to a specific responsibility for health and safety. The other thing, the workers' activities, we had a discussion at our last meeting, and the discussion centered on notions such as core activities or workers' activities, but the concept was very simple, that there was the recognition that there's certain kind of work that the organization needed to report on, and that was linked to the organization in a certain way. And this goes more to that issue, and it's often the case, in public relations, that companies report on the economic impact of their company in a community, and they calculate ways to how it ripples through the community, and they get jobs for other jobs. But this focuses just on those jobs that are being created because of the work the organization is doing, that is considered its own work. And I think that that if we had that discussion and that decision the last meeting, the consistency is to recognize that this is exactly the same thing. This is seeking exactly the same thing when we agreed on that phrase.
Yeah, no, that was also my recollection in terms of the distinction that was being made for the purpose of the glossary of terms where we had used this. So, other comments? Because I still have a question myself as to, so what is the proposed language? Because I'm still troubled by the idea, and maybe I missed it, when a significant proportion of the compensation is based on as the telling element. So we're changing this to a significant portion of the workers performing the work is compensated based on wages, right? So we're outside of compensation again, which is where we needed to be. Yeah. Okay.
So the options are a response to the feedback on the compensation terminology. Yeah.
Kirsten.
And then again, I start realizing that I have never understood this indicator, because I thought it was a requirement to report on entry wage level in the reporting organization, while this says that it's only if a substantial portion are on minimum wage. But it would still be interesting to know, is this the case or not? Just not taking out the indicator, because it isn't a big proportion of the employees. So it's unclear. The concept of the indicator is pretty unclear as it is.
Okay. Chelsea?
Yeah, I would just second that, and I think that's important to look at when we're going between option 1 and option 2. The way that I would read this is the first half of the sentence is a qualifier as to whether or not the second half of the sentence even matters to you. So when a significant proportion of the workers / employees are compensated based on wages subject to minimum wage rules, comma, then here's the reporting requirement, report the ratio of the entry-level wage, et cetera, et cetera. So we're having all this discussion about the first part of that, which is the qualifier, but what's not clear to me as a reader is, does that impact carry through to how you're reporting that ratio? Because it looks like there, the wild card is how you're defining significant locations of operation, and whether those are your own sites controlled by you, sites where work of your organization is being carried out, etc. So I wonder if the context of the conversation we're having actually relates more to this, how are you defining the parameters, which is already covered a little bit under C. We're giving quite a lot of flexibility already. Sorry, there's not a suggestion in there. Just
Hidemi?
I think this concept is not clear for me too. And also the title is, I don't know, I cannot understand what it means. It's completely misleading somehow. Market presence sounds like a market share or something like that. It's quite, at least if we keep this concept, I mean, we need to change this title at least.
Okay, other comments? So, I would, so I agree with, I never understood the title. I don't know where that came from, but this is a case where I think if we could come up with a better title, I would go for it, notwithstanding this is what G4 called it, because it made no sense, but, oh, yes, Salema.
Apologize for being late. Well, in terms of market presence, when you are hiring workforce and skilled executives in local communities, you increase your market presence by promoting positive indirect economic impact. That's why back in G3, this aspect was called market presence. So this is one thing. We can change the name in the next stage of the revision, but I would stick with the title as not perfect as it is because it's a G4 aspect, right? And I'm struggling to understand the letter A. I'm not sure if it's a language issue or if there's no precise link before the significant proportion with the entry-level wage. So I'm not understanding this modification at all. I apologize for that, but I need a better explanation what it does mean.
Well, the only thing that's changed from G4 is striking out the word "the workforce" and substituting "workers performing." So the rest of it is already in G4. So, Judy?
Yeah, I mean, related to that, I have to confess that I struggle slightly with the language around wages subject to minimum wage rules, simply because, I mean, maybe I just don't really know what that means, but it just, if there are minimum wage rules, I would wonder who's not subject to them. It would seem to me that everybody would be if they're rules. You know? So I don't really know how to interpret this. Is my point.
Dwight?
As I mentioned before, I think that what they mean by subject to minimum wage rules is whether they're paid by the hour, and if so, what is the statutory requirement for minimum wage per hour. So I think that is not so mysterious. Also not mysterious is what the technical committee did. They did not try to change the standard or the meaning of the standard. All they tried to do was eliminate one word, workforce, in favor of what would be agreed to be its synonym, and that's all. I don't think the members of the technical committee considered the value of the standard. Had they, I think it probably would have been 2-1 or 3-0 that it wasn't quite right, but we didn't do that.
Okay, Bastian, and then Kristen.
Maybe a proposal for the way forward. This is really just, as Dwight just explained, a change in terminology based on a recommendation of the technical committee. We're returning to discussions of whether this disclosure has value in itself. And it is a disclosure that is in the guidelines since G3, unchanged in terms of requirement, and has been carried forward. I think one of the options, again, is actually to identify this particular standard for priority in terms of review, and to look at that. I don't think, having been there before twice with the predecessor of the GSB, the TAC, on this particular disclosure, that we can resolve this in this meeting.
Kirsten?
Just a comment to Dwight saying that minimum wage should be pretty easy to understand. It isn't to me. Minimum wage rules does not apply in every jurisdiction. That varies from country to country, and And it can be interpreted in different ways. For instance, what is the minimum tariff, wage, etc., etc.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Judy? No? Salema?
Now I got why I got confused. It's the substitution of the word workforce by the workers performing the reporting organization's activities. Let's substitute workforce for employees. Then it makes very clear that we are referring only to the own employees of an organization, which is the background for this indicator. So in my experience supporting companies to report this indicator, I only advise the organization to report their own workforce, not the third parties or contractors or suppliers. So let's keep with the word employees compensated based on the wages subject to minimum wage rules. In Brazil, it makes a difference. It is a very important indicator because depending on the region where an organization operates, this ratio can be very different. People from the south, it's making more money than people from the north performing the same activities. So it's very important, actually.
Even within the same state, there can be significant differences in minimum wage.
Dwight?
The committee unanimously interpreted workforce to be broader than employees, and interpreted that, and that's why they made the recommendation to the committee. The workforce was a problematic word, but it certainly went beyond employees, and therefore you would not, because if it didn't go beyond employees, you could just use employees.
Can I just respond to that, please?
Salema?
It's very quick. Well, and then I have to support Kristen. I always interpreted this indicator in a very wrong way. For me, the former indicator refers to the own workforce of an organization. It does not refer to their contractors or suppliers. I always support the companies to report only their own workforce. This ratio about their own workforce.
Katja?
Yeah, just to clarify, I think Laura mentioned that earlier, so workforce, it's not just a matter of interpretation, it was before in the G4 guidelines, employees plus supervised workers. So it was definitely considered as a broader term than employees in G4.
Yeah. Other comments? Chelsea?
Just one possible suggested way forward. I wonder if we go with the other option for the first disclosure here, which is the qualifier as to whether or not this reporting the ratio actually is relevant to be reported. And then we add into C perhaps an explanation of how the ratio in A is calculated, including which workers are included. You would allow the flexibility, given that we think this indicator has some fundamental issues, to still actually define that ratio as based on employees, or to go further, as long as there's an explanation of how that's being done. It might be a middle ground while we prioritize this for future review.
All right, so we need to, call the question unless there's another comment. What we have is perhaps a question of interpretation of G4, where it had been workforce and supervised, or employees and supervised workers, which would say to me it's broader than just employees because it specifically said supervised. The question I would have is whether this workers performing the reporting workers performing the reporting organization's activities, whether that is a bit beyond even just the workers who are subject to supervision and in the workforce, such as we've used on occupational health and safety, and I recognize that there's a distinction there. But the question is, are we creating yet another boundary quagmire, for people to try to sort out, how to define this? Because this arguably could reach well down into the supply chain, and maybe that's what we want, and I'm not suggesting it isn't, but it is probably a lot different than how most people have, or most organizations have currently interpreted G4. So Michael was up first and then Dwight. Michael.
It's not an area I profess to know a lot about, so I'm not sure of the technical part of this, but some feedback I have been getting is that we're getting too complicated in our standards. And if we're introducing, different boundaries for different things, it's just, unless we really have to, I'd be, Occam's razor, I'd go with the simpler solution. So I'd be very much swayed if we could come up with something simpler. Even deleting this wouldn't probably wash with anyone, but deleting the qualifier, is this not something that could be reported by everyone? And if it's not material, you don't report it. So get rid of the complexity just by saying, start the sentence at, report the ratio of entry level, blah, blah.
Dwight?
We, at our last in-person meeting, discussed the idea of in some way providing additional guidance to workers who were performing the activities of the organization. And one of the ways that that guidance could have been was for the organization to declare what its core activities were. And therefore, it would then create the base for all of this. But there was no traction for that idea. So it wasn't in the conclusion. So we're left with having a decision to provide little guidance and the consequence of providing little guidance. But I get to the point that the purpose of the measurement is still this broader economic impact, and you change the indicator fundamentally if you get away from that. Now, if there's technical problems in doing this, I think you might want to revisit them, but I don't think you can say, well, the purpose of this indicator is to measure the economic impact of the organization, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do something easier. We're just going to say that's the purpose of the indicator. And I don't think you can. I think you can certainly revisit this as technically as the way to go about testing this component of sustainable development. But I don't think you can sort of change the purpose in order to make it easier to respond to.
But, so I hear that. But if we go back to, if we're trying to keep to a minimum as best we can, the changes to G4, if we go back to the definition of workforce, as I understood it, as employees plus supervised workers, I'm not clear on why that isn't what was defined as in the earlier section where we call them the, controlled, activities controlled by, because I'm not sure, this doesn't speak to supervised. It speaks to, a much broader potential. And so I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm trying to root this back into the changes we make need to have some substance in what we said we were going to do, which is not unnecessarily change the content requirements of G4. And my interpretation of this is that we potentially have expanded it greatly by this definition, as opposed to what we've been using for the occupational health and safety, for instance, the supervised and controlled activities. Dwight?
There's a difference between supervised and controlled. That I think, I tried to sort of explain this in our last discussion on the other standard. To supervise, for instance, if you have an agency worker that's performing work for your organization, and you're the user enterprise, and you direct those workers, you could say that those workers were supervised. But if you had a relationship where you had people on commission conducting sales for you, those are not necessarily supervised, although you're in fact controlling the work. So I think that control and supervised are not identical in every case. That's the problem.
I agree, but all we're doing is introducing yet a third boundary here by this language, is all I'm suggesting. So, Dwight?
there's basically three scopes that the technical committee looked at, and one of them is this general kind of scope, which is not here. But the two that were specifically mentioned by Katya in the report, this is one of them. This is the second scope, which is the work, the activities of the organization. So the technical committee introduced two scopes. One was specifically for health and safety issues, and the other was specifically for work that was linked to the organization's activities. This is the second one. It's not new.
Katya?
Yes, in addition to Dwight, so this is the scope as it is also used in the former G410 disclosure, one of the key disclosures that is already now in the foundational standard.
Chelsea?
Two quick points on that. The first is that in G410, where we had this lengthy discussion, again, organizations' activities was used as a qualifier to then provide a narrative qualitative reporting. So it's not about a quantitative measure. But I wonder, and this may be a controversial suggestion, but the technical committee has been able to eliminate the use of workforce in almost all of the disclosures, looking at this in a case-by-case basis. One cop-out way to possibly deal with this is to keep the disclosure the same, which would mean leaving workforce in this disclosure, but then define what we mean by workforce in actually the guidance. And we have done that for glossary terms where they're only relevant to one specific disclosure. It's not a perfect, consistent approach, but we know that this one is likely to be prioritized for review. We would not change the reporting requirements, nor are we fixing anything, but we are basically keeping things consistent without permeating the future use of these terms, which we know should be time-bound going forward. So that would mean keeping the disclosure, but defining in the guidance that this relates to employees and the language that's currently used around supervised workers. Just a thought.
Well, it doesn't sound like we've changed anything, so. Salema?
No, sorry.
No? Okay. Dwight?
Well, I think, first of all, the technical committee did not recommend the use of the word supervised workers either. And it did not recommend the use of the word workforce. And the reason for that was to avoid too many terms saying the same thing. And they then therefore recommended the treatment of workers be given different scopes under different circumstances, and that's the recommendation of the committee. And I don't think it's going to, I think it's going to confuse matters more. I think that if we want to return to this, we either accept the substitution made by the technical committee for the express purpose of consistency and limiting the number of terms. If there are problems with the scope after that, that was already discussed fairly thoroughly in the last meeting, and perhaps it should be revisited, but I don't think adding a specific exception, because on this particular standard today, we all of a sudden saw what the problem was of scope. I mean, it's the scope problem is there. There is work that is performed by people that the organization can impact, but there's also work that's performed by people because the work they're performing is in some way linked to the organization's purpose or activities, goals, products, or however you want to say. And in this second case is what is being sought here, because what's being sought here is the economic impact of the organization conducting its activities in a specific location.
Okay, other comments? Okay, so I need Kristen.
I do hear what you are saying, Dwight, but still I believe that Chelsea's proposal could be a possibility, as this will be only for a period anyway. We have to review this more thoroughly going forward. And then it's better to have the status quo than changing it to something that have to be changed quite soon anyway.
Other comments? Okay, so we need to draw to a conclusion. So what I've heard is that there is a proposal that we carry over in total the specific language of G4, which in this case would retain the workforce language, everything else stayed the same. We would put into guidance, some further definition of explanation of what workforce is, which I'm not sure how it's going to be different than this, but and the other is that we just go with what we have here and see what happens, relative to the public commentary, because we did in the spirit of asking the technical committee to look at the worker-employee terminology. This is clearly the term workforce was in scope, and this is their recommendation for addressing the consistent use of terminology. So to me it's I don't. There are other choices, but I'll just get it down to the two of we just carry forward with workforce and provide some additional perhaps clarification of what that means. I'm not sure it's going to be any different than the definition we've thrown in here because I'm not clear what else we would say about it. Or we just go with this and address the consequences of it at a future point. So Chelsea?
Yeah, just to clarify, I think if we were to keep workforce in, we would define that just based on the current definition, which is in the glossary, which is employees plus, and then we use the wording around supervised workers. So it is a little bit different than what's in here. But again, that would only be relevant to those who are even reporting against this topic. Agreed, it's not perfect.
Dwight?
Yeah, I would be strongly opposed to this for two reasons.
To which?
To
Either of the options?
No, to the proposal made by Chelsea.
Okay.
And the reason for it is it sort of takes two recommendations of the technical committee, not one, and puts them aside for a standard with the argument that we need to change the standard. And I think that it makes things a lot worse. If everybody agrees that this is not the ideal standard, I think you should take the recommendation of the technical committee, which was to eliminate the word workforce. Oh no, they want to eliminate the word workforce. Let's keep the word and add that word to a definition to the other definitions that the technical committee has recommended. So let's have another definition about the same thing. That's the first mistake. Then the second mistake is that you would want to use the concept supervised workers, which is something else the technical committee recommended that you not do. So let's take the second recommendation to the tech and also create a exception in the same place where there are other definitions dealing with the same subject. Now and all of this is for a standard everybody agrees is not right and needs to be re-examined. I think this is, I'm not sure how you would describe this, but I think you're fixing it too much and in a way that will cause confusion in other parts of the standard. So I think what you should do is just take this one change, the elimination of workforce, go with it, realizing that the whole standard is sort of problematic and it needs to be revisited.
Okay, so we're clear on where you stand. Kristen?
For me, the alternative then is to go for option 2, only using employees, which should be clear with the task force recommendation in one issue and in opposition to the task force in the other one. Thank you.
Salema?
I do support the alternative suggested by Kirsten because I'm still struggling with this idea of the the ratio, the minimum wage. It relates with the whole workforce, the whole suppliers and contractors. I'm checking the guidance, the compilation, and I'm sure that it refers only to the own employees of an organization. It does not refer to the suppliers and contracts and supervised workers.
I'm sorry, what doesn't?
The previous indicator, EC5, refers to the own workforce of the reporter organization. It's not, well, in my opinion, and am I checking the guidance and the compilation at G4 implementation manual, I do understand this workforce as on employees, so I do support the suggestion made by Kirsten.
Simeon?
I can't remember what G4 guideline says, to be honest, but I had the same interpretation as you. So we have been reporting on employee alone as well. Like we're not changing the content of this. I understand, but it is a very confusing indicator, and I think my company has been trying to interpret it in their own way and just do it and just did it in the past, and but we've always struggled to understand how do we actually do it, because if you take into account contractors, say if you have people working in your office that belongs to another company through an agency, then the entry level wages, it could be above the statutory requirement, but to do a ratio, then you get very different numbers. You get a range of numbers, and how do you can come up with one ratio to report? Then you're then faced with this situation of you need multiple ratios to report every category, and it becomes so big, it's just almost impossible to do. And then we looked at the guidelines again, and we thought, okay, let's just do employees and be done with it. And we've just always been doing that, throughout since G3. So I think the point is, I think this needs a lot of work to correct. But in the spirit of not changing things, I think changing that to employees is indeed a way out, at least as a temporary measure.
So, Laura, could you enlighten us as to what the actual guidance says?
Yeah, sure. So indicator G4EC5 looks at the workforce, and then in the glossary of the G4 guidelines, we have a definition for total workforce, and that is the total number of persons working for the organization at the end of the reporting period, and that is the sum of all employees and supervised workers. And then we have a definition for supervised workers, and that is an individual who performs regular work on site for or on behalf of the organization, but is not recognized as an employee under national law or practice. The page numbers are to...
Thank you, Laura. We are looking at different pages. Yeah, at the glossary, I know, but if you go through the guidance to this indicator, EC5, you will see some parts of it that refers to the organizations level wage by gender. And the documentation sources will be payroll department of the organization, or finance, treasurer, or accounting. So since G3, as Simon, I used to support the companies to report only this information only about their own employees because of the source of information, the compilation for all significant locations of operation, identify and compare local minimum wage to the organization's entry level. So yes, it's not precise. Yes, I should check the glossary for the workforce, but the relevance, the guidance and compilation, they're telling me that it refers only to the own workforce for an organization. And if you research within the, 10 or 11 or 12 diverse sectors, you will find this same interpretation. So maybe we should stick with the suggestion made by Kirsten, and then we have a lot of room for improvement.
Daniel?
I'm going to have to side with Dwight on this one, and David's earlier comment as well, which is if you go with employees, you're really missing the sense of what this indicator should be doing. And I think if you're asking the companies, you're going to get the employee interpretation, but if you're asking a human rights organization or a labor organization that's defending workers, you're going to get the opposite. And I think we do need to work into, in time, an evolution towards a more broad interpretation. I don't know that right now is the right time to do it, but we did ask a technical committee to look at this, and I would defer in doubt to the conclusions of the technical committee if we are so divided.
Other comments? Michael?
I mean, it seems that there is a conflict in G4 as it is, so it's contradictory. But if the intent, and I understand from what Dwight was saying, and it makes sense that the intent was to be broader, then to go narrower now and to put it to employees, even though it's easier, would sort of make it difficult to expand it back out later when we review it. So I'd be hesitant to do that, to go to employees, even though it is simpler. My question, though, would be that if we go with the wording that was suggested by the group, or technical committee, would that be explained? Because I must admit those words just don't do it for me. I don't really understand what I'd be reporting. Activities, whatever it was, of the company. Or, yeah. So it's a question. Is there support guidance on that would help people understand what it meant?
Kirsten?
Would there be?
In Norwegian, we have a proverb saying that the best can be the enemy of the good. And I feel we are a bit here. That yes, ideally there are lots of things we would have liked to report on and to be completely comparable across sectors, industries, companies, etc., etc. But in reality, this is very challenging. And if we are able to find a rather good indicator that might be possible to report on, that's probably better for this cause than trying to get everything out of it, making it even more challenging to report, making even more reporting organizations saying that no, this is too complicated, we cannot go for it.
David?
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, under G4, we want people to do a materiality test. We don't want them to provide information on every indicator, so every standard that there is now. We want them to look at things that are important and material to the organization. I feel that it's unlikely that this, if we put employees in here, is going to be something that's material to most organizations. But if they employ a lot of workers outside of that, who are paid less than the minimum wage, it seems to me that is something that's material, and it would be of very great interest to the wider stakeholders of those organizations, but also something that those organizations need to address in the long term. And I think that's the focus of this indicator. It's not the ability to report on something that's easy to measure.
Okay, thank you. Dwight?
Since 1977, the International Labor Organization has adopted an instrument called the Tripartite Declaration of Principles Concerning Multinational Enterprises and Social Policy. And they ask their constituents, in particular their governments, to every 2 years report on the effect being given to that declaration. And part of the issue in the declaration is the conditions of work of multinational enterprises. And the reports almost always say that the wage levels of multinational enterprises are higher than the other enterprises operating in the same nation. But the conclusion now is that that's because the multinational companies might pay their people higher, but they create other entities in order to carry out their work, or they carry out their work through distinct organizations. And so this isn't quite a useful measure, because in reality, the contribution of multinational enterprises to significantly higher wages is not all that big and not all that important. So This question goes in the opposite direction. It's sort of looking at what is the effect of the company in this given community in terms of raising other wages, which is quite distinct from this other notion that I just mentioned. And I think that's what the measurement is about. And that's what the purpose of the question is about. And I really think that the problem we had the earlier report from Katya, we had the discussion in the last meeting. I think that for all of the unhappiness with this indicator, this standard, I don't think I think you should basically accept the change of the technical committee and move on. It's not right, but I don't think that we're really smart to make it worse. I mean, and the issue is, well, the debate here is whether we take something bad on one hand and go with it, or whether we make it worse and then go with it. And I think that's what the discussion is.
Thank you. Zulema? No? Okay, so we need to draw to a conclusion here, because we're at risk of repeating ourselves. So can I just get this is not a vote, but I guess the chair would like to get some sense as to where the board is on this question of, basically it's coming down to option 1 or option 2. And so if I could get just a signal, show of hands for those of the board that would support option 1, which is workers performing the organization's activities. Can I get a sense? Thank you. Can I get a sense of those that would support option 2? Okay, so the majority is in favor of option 1. So now I get to the delicate question of, is there sustained and substantial opposition to a consensus that we go with option 1 for purposes of this release? So those that feel strongly about option 2, now is your chance to come up with a new argument that will sway the majority here. So Judy.
So I am in favor of option 1, but I just wanted to say that actually I could live with either one of them, and I'd rather not have this be a case of just the majority prefers option 1, so let's go with option 1. But I'd rather understand the depth of resistance on one side or another, and if we can accommodate one or the other, with most people being pretty much satisfied with it, then it doesn't matter to me whether it's option 1 or 2.
Okay, thank you. Hidemi? I need to go.
I think listening to the conversation now, I support option 1. But I think to go with option 1, I think we need to change some text in the background content, G. It's quite, what it says is a really positive side, only, contribution to local community or something like that. It's a little bit, context is a bit different. So maybe we need to mention about a little bit, let's say, negative impact stuff here. So I think we need to modify this if we go with option 1. And also I mentioned about this title. It's I prefer rather than the market presence, but maybe some local employment or something like that would fit more. And then I think this issue should not be in economic things, not 400 something. I think rather be in the 600 series, I believe.
That's a new discussion. So, Simeon.
Well, option 1 is just going to be impossible to do, really. I mean, if we keep with just changing those words and not splitting it up, with the example that I gave just now, I mean, it's just impossible to come up with one ratio, basically. So I will be ending up with many ratios, categorizing things into like contractors, and then entry level at different departments with different qualifications will be different. I mean, it's just, and then also if we do option 1, we are basically correcting an interpretation that most people got wrong. And from what Laura said, most company reported had interpreted that as employees, and now we're saying they're wrong. And I don't know what the reaction to that would be.
consternation, I would imagine. Kirsten? Oh, Salema? Okay.
During the past 3 minutes, I've checked 15 G4 reports, and I got EC5 from 15 reports in a brief research within the internet, and the 15 companies are reporting their own employees as the ratio for EC5, G4 EC5. Having said that, I'm strong disagree with option 1, but if it's the majority of the board it's voting for option 1, I will not stop the consensus, but I have to support what Simon just said. It will cause, at least among my clients, a huge concern, because they've been reporting in a very wrong way this item. And because it's not clear, since G3 and G4 just repeated the unclear and unprecise guidance, but this is the reality. So I have to strongly disagree with option 1, but I'm not stopping consensus.
Okay, thank you. Kristen, now.
Good speech, Sulema. Yeah. Option 1 is really, really challenging. And then I come back to one of my previous suggestions here, that we should divide option 1 in 2, so that give it for own employees and give it for the other workers performing work for the organization, because then it would at least be possible to give a qualitative explanation of how this is being handled regarding other workers. For own employees, it's challenging enough to collect this information. And when we're talking about gender, etc., and ratios related to gender, it isn't really meaningful to do simple mathematical calculations here, because there are so many other things that come into the picture to be able to evaluate if there is equal pay for equal work in the organization. But that's another matter that should be raised in a later review of the indicator.
Okay, thank you. Daniel?
To my colleagues who are still set on option 2, I think that going with option 1, if we do consider, and I think it was Michael that suggested it, I mean, we do presume that there is some sense of analysis of materiality, and that the interpretation can be broader if one chooses to do so. If a company decides to go with an employee-bound definition, and it explains why it is doing so and why it's not taking the other route, I don't see that as a problem necessarily. I do see a problem, though, and I think Dwight said it several times, of narrowing our field of operation to option 2 and leaving out what really the stakeholder community is asking for, which is option 1. And I would say that likely, yes, everyone is probably reporting option 2, but that doesn't make it right. I think we do need to move beyond this.
Okay, thank you. Nikaimura?
I think if we go with option 1, I think reality is many organizations will just report only on the employee number. I think that is a reality. But I think that we need to deliver our message. It's just what we want to have is not only the numbers of employees, so maybe more total workers. So in this regard, as Laura previously suggested, maybe we can go with option 1, and also the ask the report to the definition of their workers, at least for this indicator. Then we can deliver the message, which direction we want to go, but maybe there we can identify the gap of the reality. But I think this is a really important step to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Newcomer?
I agree with Mr. Hidemi. The basic challenge here, as I see, is what Simeon said is the number of layers of workers, where you may have to report the ratio. But the same challenge will come at the employees also. You will have number of layers. So the challenge between the worker and employee is not different. But whether the intent is whether we want to address the risk, whether we want to address the challenge, that well, there are differences in the wages, and especially in the supply chain, or especially in the subcontracted activities, and that is where the world is moving. More and more outsourcing. When the more and more outsourcing happens, the wages go down, and that is what needs to be reported. Thank you.
Simeon?
First of all, I don't think companies can interpret it the way they want and just report employees, because it says shall. And materiality is supposed to be done on the topic level, not at indicator level. So, so if reporters do what you just said, it'll be not in accordance with the standard. So that is not an option. And yes, the level of complication is the same, but if you roll it up into one number, which is what it's asking now, is one ratio, then it becomes impossible. So, so I agree with you that the complication with just employees and the contractors is the same, but it has to be two numbers. So at least has to be two numbers. So if we're going to change that, it has to be a more substantial change. It has to be split into two numbers. And one way of doing it is like what we did in the last standard, is to make the shall bit for employees only, and in the recommendation say you should consider reporting for contractors as well. And that will be, I think, acceptable way forward for me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dwight?
First of all, I just wanted to state that I would find it very difficult to acceptably change to the option 2, because I do think it changes the purpose of the standard, which I don't see as a solution to the problem. And of course, when we look at the behavior of reporters, and we see that reporters are responding a certain way to a certain kind of question, and it's not the way that we wanted them to, I think that that's an important message that we have to take into account. I just don't think that you necessarily change the standard to accommodate the way the reporters are reporting. I think that it doesn't automatically follow that we do that. And in this particular case, I don't think that's the solution. So I basically feel very strongly about this because of the recommendations of the technical committee, which did not seek to change the disclosure. They did not do that. They didn't say, well, we want to change the disclosure because we think it's not right. All they did was substitute a word. And I think that I have heard no argument made today that says that that word that they sought to substitute needs to stay. I have heard the argument that we should have another definition on top of similar definitions, but that's just not strong enough, and I think it's a very bad idea. So I'm going to hold forth and say I think that we should take the recommendations of the technical committee, approve this disclosure, and come back to the whole disclosure later on, because we all recognized its weaknesses.
Okay,
But
thank
the
you.
patches are worse than the solution.
Thank you. Michael?
I was just going to support what appeared to be emerging as a consensus, that that you go with one but subcategorised. That sounded sensible to me.
Categorized in making one shall for employees and recommended should for
No, that's option
everyone?
2, was making it a shell for employees and others, like two categories, employees and others, making it clear there are others besides employees, recognising, however, that some people may not be able to do that implicitly, or that the number might be difficult or whatever. So,
But both as shall.
Both on shall, but it serves Dwight's point because it emphasises the point. It's not just employees, but it also allows you to report employees and say the other's just too hard, or it's based on these figures or whatever. Which I thought was what Kirsten was suggesting earlier. And,
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on this and a lot of good thoughts. So there is a third option, which would be this bifurcation or splitting it up so that it's very clear that that it is relating to employees, but also making it very clear that there is an intention that it be other workers performing organizational activities. And it would potentially provide, and I'm not suggesting this is a good idea, a good thing to happen, but it would at least allow those that have previously interpreted as employees only to continue to report, and then they can avail themselves to the extent they think they need to of the omission along with when they're going to expect to get the information, such as provided for in any other indicator that they currently aren't reporting on. But it certainly would clarify any misunderstanding that this was intended to be something more than workers, which I'm satisfied it was the intention. But I realize there is conflicting information in the guidance that might lead one to a different conclusion. So is there support for this third option, which is to have a explicit requirement as it relates shall for employees, and then a second one that deals with workers in addition, or workers performing the organization activities other than employees, I guess is how you'd have to say that, because you want to add them up to say, or excluding, or however you want to say that, both as shall statements, thereby giving the organization, we can continue to get what we've had, but signal very clearly that the intention was the broader picture, and if they need to avail themselves of the omission, then they can do so and signal when they're going to do it. Does that work? You can live with that. So you'll live another hour. So that's good, at least. Are we good with that? Can we capture that?
Sorry, I'm struggling to capture that. So maybe it's worth, I can show you what I've got to work through it. So to me, then the first requirement is around reporting on employees, report the minimum wage at significant locations of operation. The second one is around workers performing the organization's activities. So we have two reporting requirements now.
Correct. That is correct. Dwight?
Except that had
Chelsea, a drafting thing. I think what you would do is you would have employees, and in the second situation, you would say other workers. So therefore, that you recognize that employees technically are workers performing the organization's activities. And I think that's how we did it in the technical committee, wasn't it, more or less? We used the concept of other workers.
All I want is it to be very clear as to that it is not duplicative, but it is in one category or the other. So Katja?
Yeah, that was then very text specific, but we used the wording other workers if in the paragraph before there was a clear reference to employees, and then it would talk about other workers.
Okay, so
We're
Chelsea.
going to look at the text before
Please.
we approve it.
If we can. I think this is a reasonable compromise given our circumstances. I mean, because I do think that well-meaning people have different interpretations of what was meant, and if we have some ability to clarify what we think it meant in this, then we have an obligation to do so without inadvertently adding to the reporting burden beyond what at least some would say was the original intent of the G4, notwithstanding how it was interpreted. So I think this is potentially it. So this is it? Okay.
As I understood it.
Okay. So let's pause for a moment and people can read it. Feel free to room if you need to read it. I realize young people need to get closer to the screen. Dwight.
Chelsea, I would just add after workers in this, in B, performing the organization's activities.
Do you have the keyboard? What? It's very bad setup.
Michael?
Should the actual what you have to report is the same in A and B? So should it be report the relevant ratio of the entry level wage? That is the one pertaining to employees in the first case, or pertaining to other workers in the second case? Or the associated, or whatever.
A and B should be the same in that respect.
Yeah, but they should, what you report should pertain to the qualifier.
So are people satisfied that the use of the employees in A is clear? Is the use of other workers in B clear? So everybody's okay with that? Because I just feel compelled to say other workers, not meaning non-employees. I just in the abundance of being clear, but maybe it works for others. But I just would like to get Simeon.
No, it's kind of unclear to me actually. If we say that that encompasses a lot of people, workers performing organizing activities, there's just so many of them.
That's true.
Yeah, that's
I
not.
agree.
That's
the
other
point.
than just contractors. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very broad.
Yes, it is. Kirsten.
I just said to Dwight that I completely agree with him, but now I see that, yeah, I do agree with Simon that this isn't clear. What is the organization's activities? Is
We had
that
that-
for
we had
any
that debate.
supplier, for any supplier at any site?
So we
throughout
had
the
that
world?
discussion at the previous meeting, and Chelsea.
We did have that discussion, but I do think it's important to look at this in context. So when we had the discussion around G410, that was just a qualifier. And the discussion we had was that if a large portion of the work that's being carried out, whether it's core activities, organizations' work, is done by non-employees, then give us a narrative. Here, we are actually asking, I think, the way that this is phrased, you would have to then quantify, right, these workers. And I think that's a subtle but really important distinction for us to wrap our heads around.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Okay. Is that in the form of a suggestion of changes to this, or because?
My suggestion would be, based on everything that we've been circling around, that either we leave it as workers in A, which I think are workers performing organizations' activities, but we give a qualifier in D that in addition to defining significant locations of operation, you also have to explain how you've interpreted worker in that ratio. Or that we make B essentially a reporting recommendation, that you also report this disclosure for other workers who are not employees. Those would be my suggestions. I think this is going to be very tricky to interpret correctly.
Okay. Dwight?
Well, in that case, we might consider the reporting requirement of how they arrived at that figure, as you suggested. I just can't help but recall the last meeting where there was a proposal that we have the organization define what its activities were and then reference back to that all of these questions that that would require that answer. And so the reporting organization would do that. That was proposed, and it wasn't, nobody went with it. And so apparently they didn't understand the problems that was proposed to address. But in fact, it was trying to address a problem, which will then reoccur not only here, and I don't think the solution to that problem is always going to be let us separate employees and other workers out and do the definition. So I think that in this particular case, maybe you want to come up with a disclosure of how this figure was arrived at. But then again, we might have to revisit the whole reporting thing and see how these figures can be arrived at, in the sense that an organization can, I think, determine who's performing its own activities if in fact it understands what its activities are. But what bothers me about all of this is that this was a discussion. It actually took place in this body.
Understood. Bastian, you had a comment?
Just to confirm that the reference to organizations' activities is in the exposure draft that went for public comment. So that it exists. The organization right now, under what we've put out for exposure, is requested to explain the organization's activities. So there is a reference that would shed light on what is entailed here for this particular disclosure if you connect it back to that explanation elsewhere in the report following a general standard disclosure.
Michael?
I'm not sure that making it a recommendation rather than a requirement would help, particularly because if people can't interpret it, they wouldn't be able to interpret it as a recommendation or a requirement, it seems to me. We may have had that discussion, Dwight, but it probably meant different things to different people at the time. I just certainly didn't understand this depth of difficulty with it. I mean, I can describe my activities as, I don't know, marketing pajamas or something. But how far down the supply chain do I go with that? That doesn't seem to be answered by just describing my activities. How far down I go I'll take Chelsea's point about numbers as opposed to general narrative. So, so I'd go with what we've got. I'd add the word relevant ratio, but add in a description of how they define their activities for this purpose or how they work their numbers out.
So you're suggesting an add-on to D, the definition used for significant operations, and a explanation of how they have defined their organization activities for purposes of this disclosure? Okay. Daniel?
So I'm kind of going in the same direction as Michael, but I was looking more at B, and I understand the difficulty and the challenge of coming up with a ratio, numerical quantifier for B. So could we not phrase it in terms of narrative? I think that's what you were suggesting, Michael. But for B, for paragraph B, and so we could say something like, when a significant proportion of other workers perform the organization's activities, or and then just say describe. I'm not sure how it would read, but something like describe the nature or the information that's available, or the percentage of the workforce. Some narrative that asks for a narrative instead of a ratio.
That wasn't actually where I was going, but I wouldn't reverse the way you said.
I don't have the text in my mind right now, but.
Okay, other comments? All right, so we have a couple of options here. One, let's just take them in order if we can. Is there a strong sense that we should not split this that from employees and other workers performing organizational activities? Are we good with that split? Okay, so
As a compromise.
In life. So, having said that, now the question is on B, whether we want to retain the quantitative nature of the disclosure or move it to a qualitative nature of a disclosure. I have my own views on that, but that's the consequence here. Do we want to lower the bar, basically, by having a qualitative discussion of it, or do we want to strive for the same rigor of approach that we have for employees? And then the third piece I want to get to before we get to questions is, are we okay with expanded the definition used for significant operations and explanation of how the organization has defined activities for this disclosure, whether we're okay with that addition? Again, it'll be a description and a qualitative description. So Kirsten?
I'm not sure, or I disagree that we are lowering the bar by asking for qualitative information on other workers, following the significant amount of research that has been done now within this room and Sulema's quick web research. So my impression, and I believe that would be the impression of most reporting organizations, is that the bar is getting higher than being lower by adding a requirement on qualitative information.
Okay, so how about if I revise this to say, we put the shall is the qualitative, and we put as a recommendation the ratio, sort of kind of dividing this up in a way that, maybe it makes sense at the end of the day. I hope so. But it does two things, I guess. One is it drives why there is a distinction between A and B. But also recognize that from a recommendation standpoint and a directional standpoint, we would look for the same quantitative analysis, which means people actually go look at it and try to manage it and understand it in a much greater detail than a qualitative description might provide. So is that a middle ground that we go with the split? B, other workers is a qualitative description as a shall. We revised D to include the definition of what is included in other activities, and we moved to recommendation, the quantitative analysis of other workers. Dwight?
We need just a few more minutes to get that together.
Okay, well, basically, what I was going to speak to was D. And I wish I could quote it, but basically, I think that is not a good idea to put in a specific disclosure standard, because I think it has to be a more overall kind of explanation. And my concern is I'm seeing a pattern now in the last that and this. The pattern is we're going to separate employee and other workers whenever we find a problem, and then I'm saying, and not only are we going to do that, we're then going to try to create internal to that disclosure a way to address it. And I think that is going very much against the recommendations of the technical committee, which saw that this approach of scope needed to be addressed more universally than this. And so I don't mind looking at the division as a compromise, but then adding on top of that in D a sort of individual rule for the disclosure, I think is too much. So I'm opposed to that. I mean, in the spirit of compromise, yes on A and B, but no on the addition to D.
Okay, thank you. We're waiting for the final language here, is that what? Michael?
I mean, just on that, Dwight, I'm not sure. One of the reasons I think it's important to have that addition in D is because I don't think people will universally understand or have a common understanding of the phrase organisations when performing organisations' activities. I think that's open to interpretation. I understand activities is intended to be described, but for the purpose of this, I just think it helps clarify things. I don't think it weakens it, would be my thought.
Chelsea, you had a comment on that?
One way that we've addressed this in other standards based on GSSB comments is to refer back using a recommendation that the definition of activities should be aligned with the information reported in disclosure 201.2, where there is a requirement, which would be mandatory, to describe the organization's activities. So that might be a way that we eliminate, to Dwight's point, having to separately state this every time.
I like that. Daniel?
I was going to suggest sort of a reordering that might make that B have more sense. And let me just say it before you even try to write it down, but it would be when a significant proportion of the organization's activities are conducted by other workers, and then I jump to the end of the phrase, which is report the ratio, and finish that sentence, or describe the actions taken to determine whether these workers are paid above the minimum wage. So you're saying, if you can report the ratio, report it, and if not, describe it. So you give the option where the statistics for the company exist and they can do it, they shall do it. And if they don't have it, you're giving them the option to simply describe it. And it captures everything that's in there, it just reorders it and changes a few words to give it sort of a logical sequence. Does that make sense?
Bear with us, we're working on 2 versions. I
Yeah.
can't work mine.
Yeah.
Just have, sorry, someone said. Sorry, I should have my mic on. So I'm not sure why that is a different language there, but Dwight?
Well, actually not. The idea is that if you're paid a wage according to the laws, is the wage higher than you would have to pay at a minimum level. And that's actually what is seeking to be measured, is how much of the money are you giving to workers as compensation that are performing work, and what kind of economic impact are you having? And if you're not paying beyond the minimum wage, you're not having that extra value added of contributing to the local economy, which is what the measure is.
Simeon?
I have a problem understanding that. What are we then saying if companies are paying much more than a local minimum wage, they are then better companies?
Dwight?
We're saying that part of the market share and contribution of the company is the amount of money it introduces into the economy in the form of wages. And so the answer to your question could be yes, but not because you're a better company, but because you're having a greater economic impact, which is what the indicator is all about. So, and you're saying the economic impact is a good thing. So the idea of this indicator is how much above and beyond what you would be required to do legally are you doing? And that's, I think, what the gist of the thinking is behind the indicator.
Okay, Daniel? No. Okay, so this is our current iteration of this. Okay, so so D did not get modified as described. It's, yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, so that takes care of D. So we're left with, is this captured the sense of the board for B? So my only comment is that you'll never get the actual ratio if this is the language we use.
I don't know what we can do to get the actual ratio at this point.
Well, so I had suggested that we have as the shall disclosure the phrase after or, and then in recommendations we say you should disclose a ratio. So which maybe it's just me, but I interpret that different than I'm giving a choice of A or B, and I always choose B, and I will never choose A, and because there's nothing to encourage me to do A, unless we have it in the recommendations that you should. And then companies could still ignore it, but at least we're out there that we're trying to move this. Because if we leave it the way it is, at least I would interpret it, we will never see that ratio. Nobody will ever be challenged to come up with it because we haven't actually asked for it. But if they should, then, and it leaves us some flexibility in a future rewrite of this, to elevate it or to do something else with it. But I maybe that's just my interpretation, but I'm just one person. But my original intent would be that we shall disclose what we're doing about it or how we address it, and the should would be provide the ratio under the recommendation. So, Simeon?
The second part of B, the last part of B, describe the actions taken to determine whether these workers are paid above the minimum wage. Are we asking whether the companies are complying with the law? If so, then why above? Well, shouldn't it be at or above? I mean,
I'm sorry, but that was my earlier comment, which we got an
was it?
explanation
Oh,
of the answer from Dwight here a minute ago. Go ahead, Dwight.
A direct quote from the background context. Providing wages above the minimum wage can help contribute to the economic well-being of workers performing organizations' activities. The impact of wage levels are immediate, and they directly affect individuals, organizations, countries, and economies. The distribution of wages is crucial for eliminating inequalities, such as wage gap differences between males and females or nationals and migrants. So the question you're asking is clearly explained. Now, I'm dubious about certain aspects of this disclosure as being problematic, but the purpose of it, which I keep reminding people of, is very clear. I mean, and I think that we need to understand that we shouldn't be changing the purpose. If we want to do that, then I think instead of going about trying to tinker with the language, I think we decide not to release this disclosure today.
Well, it certainly is an option, and we may get there, but I guess I feel compelled to try to see if we can't get to a place where we are all comfortable with at least going out for public commentary on an exposure draft. So until we run out of patience or time or both, I'm just going to keep at this till we get to some language that we find acceptable.
Eric,
Chelsea?
This version mocks up your changes. We've reverted back from Daniel's suggestion, and now we break out the ratio as a reporting recommendation.
Okay. All right. Robin.
I have one question and one comment. The question is, do we have one example of a company disclosing on that ratio for non-employees? And the comment is, I mean, let's face it, if you take the case of the building activity, where you have, let's say, 80% of the workforce which is subcontracted, they never report on that. They never report. The second comment, I mean, but I would be happy with the way it's phrased. I mean, but I'm just commenting. The second comment is, if we really wanted to have, in my opinion, a valuable information, we should not restrict that to the main locations. We should ask that for the whole company, employees only, of course, but for the entire company scope.
Okay, well, now you really are into new territory under G4. So, yeah, no, I understand. Any further comments? So we have our revised language in front of us. Michael?
Small wording matter I raised before is that people understand that the first report the ratio in A, report the ratio of the entry-level wage, etc., is exactly the same as 2.4, report the ratio of the entry-level wage. So relevant, or just something that anchors it back. If others don't think that's needed, that's fine. Just checking whether you think it's needed or not. Okay. And the other thing is 2.3, just checking people are happy with that. It tells you what you need to know to interpret B.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Kirsten?
I have understood that I should actually understand what is meant with workers performing the organization's activities. Being here in the discussion in our previous meeting, still I don't understand it, and I'm then very worried about how other reporters should be able to understand that phrasing. I think we need more clarity there. Should it be understood as the organization's activities on site or under company control, or should it be understood at any place?
The reference back to the general disclosures is intended to help. So we'll get commentary on, is that clear in the general disclosures that we released at our last meeting, or not? And if it's not, then it will have a ripple effect here and several other places. So I don't believe there's anything we can do right now to make that any clearer, for purposes of this disclosure, because it actually plays to a number of other disclosures where we've used this terminology of reporting organizations, significant activities. So, Kristen?
Yeah, but in the general disclosures, formerly G410, we are talking about general narrative. And this goes far beyond general narrative.
I understand. Okay. Dwight?
Well, I think it's very fitting to bring this discussion to a conclusion by wordsmithing. And this has nothing to do with the content, but I think it would be easier if you said, easier for the reader, if you said, when a significant proportion of other workers who are not employees but are performing the organization's activities. That way it relates it to the preceding thing, and that was.
I tried for that earlier, but I didn't get much sense of it.
No, I know you did, and I'm just trying,
trying to help me out.
Get a little bit of wordsmithing in there before we take it to the audience.
Yeah. Okay. So any further comment? If not, then I'll take a sense of the board that this one is ready for release of public comment. Any objections to that? Okay. All right. So we have concluded that. I would suggest that we take a break. And that when we reconvene at 1:15, Michael Nugent will take over the chair for me. I have another meeting to attend for about an hour, so Michael will reconvene us at 1:15 and take us through the next section. Okay? Thank you.
By the time he comes back, everything will be done.
All done.